Yeah, so today I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that we've been doing at the Sydney Institute of Agriculture using neural networks, specifically deep neural networks. And I've been quite interested because they are like quite flexible, so they sort of apply to different challenges that we've had during the years. And I mean, we've been finding solutions for those challenges, and I'm going to show some of those examples here. So first, like more generally, not just deep learning in terms of machine learning. In social science, we use a lot of machine learning since the 80s, and it's broadly used, like in many topics. And well, in general, here last year I did a review about the use of machine learning in social sciences. And in general, the authors, of course, find that these more advanced machine learning methods usually perform better than simple models, which is not surprising, of course. And they say that that's due that they capture complex non-linearities in the data that they use, and also that they are very data hungry. That's not new, I guess, if you know a little bit of machine learning methods. So, like I said, they're used in many different topics, like from things related to remote sensing, soil organic carbon modeling, water, contamination, and so on. And in this talk, I'll be talking about two specific areas: a little bit of soil spatial modeling, digital soil mapping, I would like to call it, and a little bit about use of soil spectroscopy, which are the two like main topics in machine learning and soil science at the moment. First, not necessarily an introduction to neural networks, but if you think about a neural network, that's one of the first things that comes to mind. So you have like an input layer and an output layer, and in between you have a series of hidden layers. And the depth of the neural network is basically how many layers you usually have in between those. And as the data moves from left to right, when you're in the process of training the neural network, these layers are capable of extracting more and more complex representations of the data, usually in a hierarchical way. So the information that you extract in the first layers is simpler, and then it gets more and more complex as you go deeper. So as you see here, there were like a bunch of layers with neurons, and they're interconnected. So there's obviously like a network of neurons, and they're organized in layers. And if like in very basic terms, on really general terms, a layer is just like a bunch of weights and some bias that you add to this component. And then you wrap this in an activation function that, depending on the application that you have, you can change that. Then you put together multiple layers, and then you get a prediction, and then you train the neural network to try to minimize a loss function. That, depending on the application, that's another thing that you can also change in any particular neural network. So there's a lot of building blocks that you can play with and adapt it to your specific studies. So the first thing that I'm going to show you is the use of convolutional neural networks, convolutional layers, in the context of soil spectroscopy. Soil spectroscopy is something that we've been using for a very long time in soil science, where basically we have a sample of soil. We applied with an instrument some lights. The light that comes returns to the instrument. We can record that either in the lab or in the field, and we obtain a profile of that specific sample of, in a spectrum. Here we have like an example of a few spectrum with different, in this case, with different contents of clay or sand, and you see how they vary. So that's something that we usually like to exploit, so you can see all these differences. And different components have different peaks, for instance, within the spectrum. So we use that to predict different soil properties. One of the problems in general that we have with this, that we have a large number of predictors. So when in a single spectrum, depending on the resolution of the instrument or which specific areas you're sensing, you can get up to like 4,000 or more than 4,000 columns, if you wish, like that. They're usually used in that format for training a model. So usually during the pre-processing of this data, there's a few things that people do, like resampling or taking a few observations, like every 5-10 observations, and smoothing, for instance, to try to, well, reduce the amount of data and reduce the noise. So many of these operations, you can particularly do it with a convolutional neural network as well. For instance, smoothing is a convolutional operation, so we can replicate that without doing this pre-processing. So a convolutional layer or convolutional neural network is composed of some convolutional layers, where instead of having like the picture that we had at the beginning, where all the networks are connected between each other, this is like a bit more local. So we're capable of exploiting some local information within the spectrum or some other data that we're using. We did a particular study with a relatively large data set of soil samples in Europe, the Lucas dataset, almost 20,000 topsoil samples, obviously with the corresponding spectrum and many soil properties, but in this case, we used 6 different soil properties: organic carbon, clay, sand, pH, nitrogen, and CEC, electrical conductivity. Sorry, cation exchange capacity. So the idea of this is to use the flexibility of neural networks to build a slightly more complex model. So the first thing that we did in this case is we converted the spectrum to a spectrogram. That's just basically to bring a 1D representation of the data to a 2-dimensional representation. This is commonly done in audio research, and it shows really good results. And in this case, we got good results as well. And here we have the architecture of the neural network. And so, some of the things that might be different from the initial drawing that I show you of a neural network is here we have some common layers. So we have a series of convolutional layers and some other layers in between as well. They're not that important right now. And once we have all these common layers, we have different branches, one for each of the soil properties that we're trying to predict. So the idea here is to predict multiple properties simultaneously to see if we actually can exploit the relationship between these soil properties. And we did find there was a good advantage of using different properties. You can see here, moving from left to right, we add different properties. So the first one is just a single property, in this case, organic carbon. Then the next one, we add another property, any other property. That's why you have a variation there. And then at the end, we just have all the properties predicted simultaneously. So in this case, we have different branches for each property, like I said before. So at the end, we do have a huge impact when we're predicting, in this case, 6 properties simultaneously. And this is particularly important in case of soil organic carbon, which is one of the main properties that we're usually interested in soil science, because it's a good indicator of soil health or soil condition. And compared also, we have here at the bottom of the slide, compare with some methods that are usually commonly used in soil spectroscopy. like PLSR, we obtain like a huge advantage of using, well, obviously a neural network plus predicting multiple properties simultaneously. And also with slightly more advanced models, I guess. This is QBIS. It's been developed at the University of Sydney, and it's like tree-like model, which is also commonly used in solid spectroscopy. And yeah, like we got a huge advantage of using a neural network compared with those models. Of course, this is just one example that I show you. Well, I converted to a spectrogram and then try that as a 2D data, but we also have many other options, many alternatives. And after that study, we've seen like many other studies using one-dimensional convolutions, recurrent layers, which is they're quite effective for a series of data, either time series or signals, or combinations of these two, so convolutions and recurrent, like you see in this study here. So there's quite a lot. There's a lot of potential, and all the results have been great. What they show in the literature. So the next example I'm going to show you is also convolutional neural networks, but in this case, in the context of digital soul mapping. Sorry for the resolution of that image. Look a bit better in my computer. So like what we usually do with in digital soul mapping is quite a simple modeling exercise, I think, or simple to understand at least. As we have like you see here, like different soil observations, like with their specific coordinates, and we have multiple covariates that try to represent some environmental conditions, let's say elevation, slope of the landscape, temperature, precipitation, and so on. So we usually take that those covariates. We intersect them with the points, we extract the data and the corresponding pixels, and then we have a table with data and we can proceed to model that. There are some other things that we do, for instance, standardization in depth, so we can predict different layers, depth layers. And finally, we can do something like a 3D prediction of different layers, let's say 0 to 5 centimeters, 5 to 15, and so on. That's not necessarily 2D. They call it 2.5D because you're not doing it all at once, I guess. But yeah, that's the general idea. The problem with the how we usually approach digital soul mapping is that the data that we have provides a lot of context, but most of the models that they're usually used for digital soul mapping, they don't provide a way of incorporating this contextual information in terms of space. And also they ignore the relationship between multiple depths. That's what we find in literature usually. So here we have again convolutional neural networks. In this case, with us modifying the approach of extracting the data from a single pixel. What we did in this study is extract a window center at the position of the point. Let's say the point intersects this pixel shaded here in gray, and we have like a window of like X size around it. So instead of having a single value for a specific covariate, we can have like the contextual information about it. And we do that for all the covariates that we want to use in the modeling process. So effectively, we have, instead of having a vector with different, where each component is a covariate, we have like a 3D stack of images. And we use a similar, it's not exactly obviously the same network that we had before, but a similar concept. So we have like different shared layers with convolutional layers on it, where we extract the more general information. And as we go deeper, then we give the chance to the neural network to have different branches and evolve take different pathways for different depths. So the case study, there was a national model in Chile. I'm originally from Chile. Almost 600 soil profiles that we had. obviously with they were mostly located at agricultural areas. This is data from the government. And we were interested in predicting soil organic carbon at different depths. And the results were quite interesting. Here we can see that first, like in the dotted, well, the dashed line here in red, that's a reference model that's commonly used, the QIS as well, for digital soil mapping. And like the model in general with the convolutional layers perform like way better. And here we varied the kernel size, or the size of the window that we
Uh-oh, we lost him, I think.
Yeah, I think we lost him, yeah.
Is he coming back? Jose, come back, please.
The screen is still sharing, so it's still there.
Stopping my video, just no, he's gone.
It dropped. So.
We're gonna have to wait for him to come back. The challenges of the online environment.
Somebody complains about Linux.
Mario, you're being nasty.
Actually, Mario is also from Chile. He might be familiar with the experiments. Maybe he could talk.
Jose is back.
Can you hear me? Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Jose is back.
I don't know what happened. Yeah. Okay, let's continue. I hope this was the last one that you could see. Hopefully.
We don't see it. You share your slide. Need to share.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. Was that the last one? Hopefully. Hopefully I didn't talk for half an hour by myself. Okay, so we found a useful radius that it was equivalent to 150 and 450 meters, which is quite similar to if you've worked a little bit in geostatistics, the autocorrelation range of soil organic carbon reported in literature. There was like a review, one of my colleagues did it, like they checked like a bunch of barograms in literature for national and regional level studies, and they do find like a correlation, an autocorrelation range about around 450, 500 meters, which makes sense. So the more information that we add, it might be not useful actually for the network, and the performance drops. In this case, the error increases if we add more data that is not actually useful. So that's quite interesting. And now we're trying to expand this to see if, well, if that generalizes for other scales as well. So that was the result of using like the context, like a window, and this in this case is the results of using the multitask, so predicting multiple depths simultaneously. And in general, you can see in the literature, like people report that the models don't perform really well in depth, because most of the covariates that we use come from remote sensing, for instance. So they're representing mostly surface conditions. So the capacity of these models, if we are predicting just, let's say, to 1 meter, like from 1 meter depth and deeper, the covariates are not representing that very well. But now that we're predicting, so that's what you can see in the orange. So you see like a decrease in the performance. But in this case, because we're predicting everything simultaneously, the neural network takes like as hints the prediction of the top layers to make predictions in depth. And we can see that the performance is quite stable. So in general, we got in this specific case, we got a 30% reduction in the error compared with QIS, which is one of the models that are widely used in digital soil mapping. These are like quite, I guess, methodological things, but we're also doing, we're applying this to different scales. So from the global to the local scale, the farm scale. I mostly work at national or global scale, but I'm going to show you some other things that are related to the farm scale as well. So one of the biggest projects that we have where we are applying convolutional neural networks, and in this case combined with land cover tracking. So we keep track of the land cover of each pixels for many years to check any changes. In this case, is to evaluate soil organic carbon losses. So here you can see a small example in Brazil, where you have the change between the year 2001 and 2013, and agricultural areas expanded, and you can see mostly red colors here, which means that there's a loss in soil organic carbon. And we apply this to the world as well. We have a global model to do this. It's hard to see, but there's a lot of red colors there, red pixels, sorry. We're also doing something slightly different, well, obviously related to carbon, but slightly different, measuring the soil organic carbon sequestration potential here in Australia. Here we're quite lucky that we have a lot of soil profiles. If you compare it with the example that I gave you in Chile, we have a few, well, 500 at that time. Now we have like 2,000, 3,000 versus this. So it's really good to work with this data. And here we have a slightly more, or way more complex neural network. It's not necessarily that you see all the text that is there, but this is a combination of 3 models, one to predict carbon in croplands, other one in forest, and another one in natural things that are not cropland or forest. And we're mainly focusing interested in cropland in this particular study. And for each of these models, we can predict different quantiles. So this is in the framework of quantile regression. So, and we can do this with neural networks if we change, for instance, the loss function that I told you before. So it's changing one of the blocks, we can do this in like this totally different application. And well, this is just one of the results that we got. So this is, like I said, just mostly focusing in croplands, and we can see that we can, by like measuring the difference between different quantiles, we can sort of estimate what we could do, but if we do something better, how much carbon we can sequester in those soils. Obviously, depending on the types of soil, climate, position in the landscape, and that's all included in this model. Like I show you, like this, some of the examples that I've been working on the last few years, like national scale, global scale, but we're also quite interested in the farm scale. And in this case, applying, well, with neural networks, something that is called transfer learning. And the motivation to do this is, well, I've shown you some national data sets that are quite interesting, let's say for Australia, and we do have a lot of data at global scale. When we generate these models, either global or national, they show a really poor performance when they're applied at national, let's say a global map applied to a country, or a national model applied to a regional or a field scale, which is understandable, obviously. There are different scales. So in digital soil mapping, we usually, well, and I guess like many other fields, we have this these two types of model, the global or local, and usually you work with one or the other. But the motivation of this work is try to reach a conciliation between them, and instead of having like one's against the other, which one is better, which one is not, is to try to share some knowledge between the two scales. So this is like possible perhaps with other types of models, but it's particularly easy given the modularity of neural networks. in the process of transfer learning, we can do something like dissecting this neural network. I'm going to explain how that works. So we start with a model that we train in the global data. So we have this national, or let's say global model, where all the 4 layers, the weights get adjusted based on the data, of course. Then we can slice some of these layers. And like I told you at the beginning, the more general representations are closer to the beginning of the network. So we extract the more general ones. And we use those general layers to create a new model where all the more specific ones haven't been trained yet. And then we can train that model in a localized or in a local data to generate a localized model where actually just the last layer is learning, adapting the global representations that were extracted from the global dataset, and try to transfer that to a local context. So this is the quite similar architecture of the neural network with a multitask CNN that I show you, and in the same, using the same Lucas dataset for soul spectroscopy. And this case where is a European dataset, and we try to apply this transfer learning to generate national models in 21 different countries. So it was quite encouraging to see that in most of the combinations of country properties, remember they were predicting multiple properties, we show like a decrease in the final error of the model compared with training either like just a model, like a local model with the local data, or with a model trained just with the global data. So there's a synergy there when we're using the transfer learning. And what it means at the end is that we have like a reduction, obviously, of the error, and in average around 10% for multiple properties. And well, obviously less error, that's quite good, but with transfer learning, that usually means as well that we can generate really good local models, but with less data. So the data requirements drop a little bit, which is one of the problems of machine learning, deep learning, that they require a lot of data usually. So we can pre-train a model with global information and then just adapt it to the local conditions. And this is something that we're trying to expand now to the farm scale for carbon assessment. Another application that we've been doing, it's quite more like an experiment, I guess, is progressive training or online learning, how they call it in machine learning. And this is to try to go in the opposite direction. So before in the transfer learning, I showed you how we were trying to get information from a global model and try to bring it to the local scale. In this case, try to use local information to build like a global model, like bits by bits, in cases that we usually find is like when people don't want to share information or they can't share information. So, and obviously to do things like assessing solar organic carbon or any other natural resource in the world, you need a lot of information, obviously. So the more data, the better. And so this is a potential solution to use this data in, let's say, in a private way without actually sharing the data. So we did a simulation with this data set over 100,000 soil observations among many countries. So the modeling was relatively simple. So we split the data in training and validation data sets by country, and then we split this and we train the model, adding the data from one country at a time, and at each step we evaluate the model, and we did this like 1,000 times. One of the first results that we can see is how the model evolves in time as we add more countries, and if we pay attention to the blue line that we have here, this is the error of the first country that we add to the model. So when we have that only model there, sorry, that only country in the model, so a single country, the model behaves, obviously predicts quite well at the local scale, but predicts really bad in like a country that hasn't been seen by the model, obviously. So it's the transfer between one country and another, it's relatively poor, which makes sense. And as we add more and more countries to the model, we can see that the performance in the first model in the first country, start decreasing, the errors are increasing, and start behaving a little bit more like a global model that is not that good for a specific country, but is way better, but it's more general. In many countries it's making better predictions, which is what you can see with in the orange line. So we can see, like, as we add more and more countries, how the model progressed from being a local model with low characteristics of a local model towards a more global model. So that was quite interesting. And the final results is that actually after adding all the countries, I'm doing this many times, obviously, we can see that the difference actually it wasn't significantly different from using all the data at once to train a single model. So effectively, at least after a certain amount of countries that we add to this model, there's no difference at all. We do it like the model seeing one country at a time or all of them simultaneously. So this is quite encouraging. Of course, you need enough diversity to get like a really good model, but if you somehow can manage to have that diversity, you can have like a model without having to access all the data simultaneously. So those are the last two applications that I show you. It's more than the architecture, it's the way you train the neural network. So that's also one of the factors we've been playing with. And like I showed you, the results are quite interesting. And also we've been working, of course, because, well, probably, I don't know if they still say that, but that these deep learning models are mostly like black boxes and we cannot interpret them. Many people have developed methods to try to interpret them, and we've applied one of those in the context of digital soul mapping. Specifically the SHAP values, SHapley Additive explanations, the method that they use. That's based in game theory, where you can think about it like each of the covariate or they call it agents, they interact to make a prediction and win the game, basically, which is try to predict with the lowest error. And with this, we can get some sort of idea of the marginal contribution of each covariate, each predictor to the model. This is in Chile as well, so this is the same example that I showed you before. And this is just like an example of the interpretation that we can get. So for any single location, here we have, on the left, we have an observation in a valley, relatively low areas, versus another observation here on the right, which is in the Andes, higher in the mountains. And you can see like the different values of that we can obtain with the SHAP value. So the positive contributions are green and purple values are negative. It's a bit hard to see. This is for the contribution for each pixel. So it gets a bit complicated, but if we can aggregate this data, and that makes a bit more sense. And so we can see here that all the values have all the observations have an expected value, in this case of around 5.7% of soil organic carbon. But in the case of the observation that I showed you that was on the right, on the mountains where the elevation is relatively high, there's a negative contribution of the topography in this case. And because it's a less stable location in the landscape, so organic carbon doesn't accumulate as much compared with the other location that it was in a valley. So that's why you can see here, like most of the covariates are contributing positively to the accumulation, reaching a value of up to 8.5% of organic carbon in that case. So we can inspect each single observation that we're interested in to see what the model actually learned and what's the interpretation that the model is giving. More in general, that was for a single observation. We can see these are plots for all the different depths and all the different, each dot corresponds to a single observation. And what you can see here on the left is the order of the covariates. It was a relatively simple model using precipitation, temperature, elevation, topographic wetness index, and slope. And the main driver or the main contribution of these covariates to the model was, as expected, in a really long country with a huge climatic gradient, was the temperature and the precipitation first, and then important, but to a lesser degree, the topographic features. So that's good. So it's a way of interpreting the data, but also making sure that the model, but it's also a way to actually see that the model learns things that make sense. And this is another type of interpretation that we can get from this method, SHaP values. And this is just plotting like a single covariate and the corresponding SHaP values for that covariate. And here in general, let's say the one in the middle, the top, the precipitation and total annual precipitation, we can see here that we can clearly identify a threshold here, like around 1,000 millimeters of rainfall, where the contribution starts to the accumulation of organic carbon start increasing, which makes total sense in the context of Chile. So we did that, and that's, if you've read anything about SHaP values, probably you've seen the plots that I showed you before, like in many publications. But and this was something relatively new that we did, that it's calculate this for every, because we are obviously making maps of solar organic carbon, is to apply the same methodology to every single pixel and map that. So, and this totally corroborates, well, what we know about solar organic carbon, but also that the model learned that what we were expecting. And we can see here the contribution in space for each of the covariates. And just like a small example here, for a slope, well, you cannot tell from here, but I know that was the value that I showed you. So a slope has a relatively low values, and the contribution is green, which means that it has like a positive contribution to solar organic carbon, in contrast to the surrounding areas that are just really hilly areas in the coast of Chile, where the accumulation of solar organic carbon is lower. And the same for the rest of the covariates. So that was quite interesting to see. I don't know how we're doing with the time. Hopefully close to the 50 minutes. So just a closing remarks is that they're quite neural networks, from what we've seen, and they're quite flexible, and we can do many things, changing these different building blocks. And we can do many other things, like changing the loss function or the last activation of the neural network. We can do things like classification, multi-class classification, obtain probabilities. I show you already an example of quantile regression that's just changing the loss function. I show you as well multiple predictions, but we can also have multiple inputs for a neural network, so we can do data fusion, and we've been doing that well with Willem as well, with like trying to get information from time series from stations with water levels, and combine that with remote sensing, for instance, and we can combine convolutional neural networks to analyze an image, and a recurrent neural network to analyze the time series, and put that in a single model. And obviously, changing all these different blocks, we can do many, many other things. Of course, they are still data hungry. So, well, given that you have enough data to train one of these ones, and also you have the knowledge to build a network, it's not, I guess, as simple as training, let's say, a random forest model, but obviously not impossible to learn. So given you have those two things, like the neural network, provide a very flexible framework that opens, I think, exciting opportunities to solve some challenges in soil modeling, particularly, but obviously more general in any other application. And that's something that we've seen that a lot of people is using deep learning in different areas, and apparently with great success. That's it. Thank you.